Hello, good evening, and today we have a very interesting conversation. So we have moved from the touch screen and we are sitting down with P.L.O Lumumba, whose name by now you must have heard. He gave an excellent lecture at the Elisa Hotel, and Professor Lumumba has been going around the world and giving lectures, and he's had a concern and a passion about Africa to see how Africa can change. Sometimes if you listen to him, you think really we are so far away from what we can achieve. Sometimes you listen to him and you get optimistic. I'm not sure how you feel after tonight's conversation, but he's definitely here to share with us some of the things he's been saying around the world. So Africa has now two Lumumbas from our session. Patrice, who was the Prime Minister of the Congo, and now P.L.O Lumumba, the living one, and who is making a change across. Prof, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
And that was a powerful lecture last night at the Elisa Hotel.
Yes.
And we have to say that Prof is here on the platform of the PAV Answer Foundation. Paul Archibald Vianney Ansah was a famous professor of communication at the University of Ghana. P.A.V. Ansah wrote many articles and championed the cause of democracy during what we call the not so fine days in Ghana during the PNDC era. He was one of those who followed up with the breaking of the culture of silence, and spoke against anti-democratic tendencies, even during the first term of the Fourth Republic. Professor Ansah is fondly remembered for being bold to criticize government and also championing the cause of plural and free media. His foundation, set up by his friends, family, particularly his daughter, Professor Esi Ansah, hosted Professor Lumumba here in Accra as part of the foundation lectures, and it was supported by the IEA. When you entered the room for the lecture, what did you feel? I know you've done this all over the world, but what did you feel?
What amazed me was the silent enthusiasm of the audience and the mix of the audience. We had elderly people who must have lived in the days of Kwame Nkrumah. We had middle-aged individuals. We had business people. We had young professionals. So that mix was amazing, and it was indicative of the interest that people have in the future of Africa. I felt it was palpable that people want something to do. People know what is wrong, and they are asking, what do we do to move Ghana to the next level? What do we do to move Africa to the next level? And I think that is a good place to be in.
I told a friend of mine that I was going to have a conversation with you tonight, and he said, why don't you start with him on Nigeria? Nigeria has just gone through a democratic election that has returned Muhammadu Buhari, over 70-year-old man, to the seat of government. He campaigned on anti-corruption and he's won the election. Yesterday you spoke a little bit about Nuhu Ribadu and the experience he had with Obasanjo's administration. But how do you, as an anti-corruption campaigner, how did you see the events that occurred in Nigeria through the election, which has returned a over 70-year-old man back to power?
You know, there is a sense in which the return of General Buhari to the presidency of Nigeria indicates that Africa is not moving as it should. Of course, there is a sense in which people are saying that we go back to the past, in a manner of speaking. And the selling point for Buhari is that he had a short stint as the president, as a military president, and he demonstrated by what and did that he was against corruption. And it's also a statement that Nigerians are tired of corruption, and that Nigerians have identified corruption as a cancer in the Nigerian body politic. But why is it sad? It is sad that while other civilizations are now electing younger people, we are going back to the past. We are electing Buhari, which suggests that we have not developed a new crop of leaders, or that a new crop of leaders have not emerged. And that is because the old leadership has suffocated the new leadership, which is not emerging. I would have loved to see that a 50-year-old, or at worst a 60-year-old, is the one who runs Nigeria. And my hope, therefore, is that Buhari will serve for only one term to set things on track and hand over the baton to a younger generation.
That's your expectation.
That is my expectation.
That doesn't happen often. Nelson Mandela did that anyway, but it doesn't happen often in Africa.
We seldom forget that Nyerere did it before Nelson Mandela, and there is a sense
Julius
Kambarage Nyerere did it before Mandela in 1900.
Did he do one term?
No, he did not do one term. He did several terms. It was in different phase of the history of Africa, but there is a sense in which there have been good leaders in Africa. Sasiret Sekama we have Kwet Masire, we have Festus Mogai. They are examples in Africa, but the tragedy of Africa is the failure of the African leader to realize that you are not successful until your successor succeeds.
You are not successful until your successor succeeds.
Yes, indeed.
That's what you want to be the denominator of.
That is what I want to be the denominator, because if you allow your successor to succeed during your lifetime, it is demonstrative of the fact that you build institutions. The problem of Africa is the personification of office and the assumption by the typical African leader that without them, the countries will not survive. It is very reminiscent of what King Louis V of France said, après moi, la déluge, after me, the floods.
I see. Tonight we'll be talking about democracy and its expressions and whether that has contributed to the underdevelopment of Africa. But I'd like to ask you, and I'll be suggesting to you some of the antitheses that have been proposed to the thesis that you have been talking about for a long time now. What is corruption? And I know that you've answered this question in many fora, but what is corruption?
Corruption is the use of public office for private benefit. That is how I can broadly define what is corruption in the popular parlance. But corruption must also be seen from a very broad perspective. Is the corruption of morals, the deliberate decision of individuals who have been given the opportunities of trust to abuse that trust for purposes of personal, private benefit. That is how I would broadly define corruption.
So that a head of institution who is harassing women in the institution is corruption?
That is corruption.
Is it?
Yes, from my perspective, a head of institution who harasses women, who uses his office for purposes other than those that are expected in accordance with the law, is engaging in corrupt practices. Traditionally, we have allowed corruption to be defined very narrowly as bribery. Bribery is only an aspect of corruption and the most visible aspect of corruption, and that is why it is so obvious. But we must now redefine corruption. We must ask ourselves what our ethical values, what is our ethos as a people, and that, in my view, therefore, will be the true north in our definition of what corruption is.
There are those who feel that corruption is not really the central problem, the central resistance to Africa's development, that it is the incompetence of our leaders over time and replicating itself in many countries that has brought us to where we are. Because some of the countries that you mentioned in your lecture, Brazil, have high corruption incidences. The United States has high corruption incidences. Japan has high corruption incidences. And therefore, that instead of focusing on talking about eliminating corruption, if perhaps we put the competent hands to work, we should get there. What do you say to that?
There is a sense in which those who say that are actually reading from the same page as I do. That
really?
The African problem is essentially and fundamentally a failure of leadership, and that corruption is a manifestation of that failure of leadership. The reason why people engage in corruption is because these individuals have no agenda for their countries. The first reason why they want to get into public office is that they want to use public office to feather their nest. They get into public office so that they have prestige. But if you have men and women who are competent, then they will use their office for the benefit of their countries. They will not engage in activities that undermine their countries. I agree with you, therefore, that if Africa were to focus on the question of leadership, and Chinua Achebe of Nigeria, in my view, understands it very well. He says the problem of Africa is simply and squarely a problem of leadership. Your own Aikwe Ama,
when you say leadership, yes. Do you mean competence?
You know, leadership.
Are you speaking to the question that they are incompetent people who are handling the African affairs, and they've been doing it for a while? And we'll come back to how they are produced through the democratic channel, and whether that democratic channel is actually good for Africa in the end, in the final analysis. But when you say it's a problem of leadership, do you mean that a leader is incompetent? Leaders of Africa are incompetent? they are not well prepared, they lack the expertise, they lack the experience. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying, that if you look at many African countries, the men and women that we have given the opportunity to lead us are actually misleaders. They don't understand what is expected of them. They don't appreciate what is expected of them. They don't use the expertise that is around them. Because what is leadership? Leadership is the ability to identify professionals and experts in different areas and use the expertise to achieve the overall agenda that is in the interest of the nation, so that you don't have to be an economist to ensure that your country is moving in the right economic direction. Your ability to identify those who have the technical know-how, to use that technical know-how and to ensure that that technical know-how fulfills the desires of your people, because people have very basic needs. People want food. And therefore, you've got to ensure that your agriculture is right. People want medicine in the hospital, to ensure that you have medicine and properly trained personnel. People want infrastructure, to ensure that you have infrastructure. People want their taxes to be utilized well, and people must have focus. And we have seen in the recent past, and I remember during my lecture I said, within a very short stint, a young man who had not gone to school very well, Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso, was so clear in his vision as to what ought to happen to his country that he was able to put together a number of individuals to move the country in the right direction. In one sentence, therefore, I'm saying African leaders have demonstrated not once, not twice, not thrice, but times without number that they are incompetent. And even those who have had the advantage of formal education have demonstrated that the education they have does not change their minds and hearts fundamentally.
If that were so, Prof, then perhaps age is not a factor, is it? If there's a 70-year-old man, and I'm saying that because in Ghana, we're going for elections next year, and there's going to be a lot of debate about age as part of the electioneering process. So if you're looking for a leader who is competent, who can get people working, and he's 80 years old, so be it, shouldn't it?
No, I've never believed at all that age is a factor. I have seen...
So you were worried about Buhari's age?
I'm worried about Buhari because Buhari is a throwback to the past.
Or that he had been there before?
That he had been there before, and there is a sense in which he has served. He represents a different generation. So that while I applaud the fact that he has come back with the specific agenda of addressing the question of corruption, where he has demonstrated that he can do something about it, he ought to see himself as a transition president. But holding all factors constant, I want to say that I've seen 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds who are a danger to their nation. They have no ideas. And I've seen old men who have ideas, who are young, who are vibrant. So if they can demonstrate without reference to their age that they have fresh ideas and that they are evergreen, that ought not to be a factor. That ought not to be a factor.
I think you've settled the matter quite nicely, and it's going to continue. The discussion is going to continue. Tonight we're talking about churches as well, and the role of churches, and whether the churches become a landing spot for corrupt findings, etc., etc. Because in Ghana, churches play a major role. On Sundays, people are in churches, and they are superstar pastors in Ghana, sufficiently wealthy, influential in the politics and all of that, and they have all come out of this from the pulpit. And we also know that in America, during the civil rights movement, there were a lot of reverend ministers who participated in that. So I'd like you to do a comparative sort of analysis for us based on what you said yesterday. Also, we will be talking about democracy, as I said, democracy itself, the channels through which leaders are elected. One of the demerits that we learned early on about democracy is that the technical people who hold technical know-how might not want to go through the rough and tumble of elections, and therefore they don't present themselves for elections. Within that space, we'll talk about your own effort at becoming a member of parliament in Kenya, and then we will look also at South Africa. We'll talk about your own country, Kenya. We'll talk about the education curriculum. That's quite a full plate for us.
Yes,
I'm telling you all of this because I want to take a break now so you can reflect on it. And when we come back, Professor Lumumba will deal with all of those matters in this conversation that we hope will thoroughly excite you as well. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. This is Good Evening Ghana, and we have a very special guest in the studio tonight, P.L.O Lumumba. Churches. You talked about them in the lecture. In Ghana, we have the short history of the church in Ghana. Began, of course, with the colonial authority, bringing in the what we call now the Orthodox churches, the Church of England, the Catholic Church, and then later on the Pentecostals arrived as well. But over the last 30 years or so, there's been, I'm sure what has been in Kenya and around most African countries, what we describe as a charismatic church. And the charismatic church is a fusion really of the Pentecostal and a bit more stylish than the Pentecostal. They have grown superstar pastors who have become influential in the social fiber. And they've also become influential even in the political decisions that people make, such that on the eve of elections, they have a role to play in terms of how peace is achieved or in terms of how one candidate is favored one way or the other. We're talking about corruption now, and you were worried that some of these churches have become a soft landing spots for corrupt people because they take front row positions in the church, and the pastors are not whipping it out enough. Can you elaborate on that?
The church has always been a very important contributor in the national body politic of any society. If you look at the history of Africa, we will identify a number of church leaders who are in the forefront in the struggle for independence, or what in other countries would be called second liberations. In Uganda, we had Bishop Janani Luwum, who died trying to struggle against Idi Amin. In South Africa, you'll remember the activities of Alan Busak and Desmond P.L.O Tutu. And we know the activities of Emmanuel Cardinal Milingo in Zambia. In other parts of the world, we have had Cardinal Jaime Sen. So that there is a sense in which you cannot ignore the church. But there is a sense also in which, as I've said, a number of churches have emerged, a number of church leaders have emerged. And as a Christian, sometimes I look at them in line with what Paul writes to Timothy and says, in the last days there will be a form of Christianity where people will be lovers of themselves. And many of these televangelists are individuals who have identified the power of the Word of God, and they are using it to good effect. And you are right in saying that they have become very effective, they have become very savvy business individuals, they have entered into an unholy alliance with the political class, and they have subservient followers who will do anything that they want them to do. Essentially, many of these church leaders are cultic leaders who are using their position for purposes of temporal joy. But that is not to say that they are not good individuals. They are good individuals within the evangelical movements. They are good pastors within the Pentecostal movement. And if they use their position positively for the better interest of the nation, then they can move the agenda forward. Remember that these individuals have captive audiences on a daily basis, people who believe in them. And if therefore they could use their position to speak about the interest of the country, if it is Ghana, they ask the fundamental question, what is in the best interest of Ghana? And they allow their congregation to use their voting card in a positive way so that they can elect and give opportunity to men and women who can serve Ghana and by extension Africa. But many of these individuals, I dare say without fear of contradiction, are also doubling up as influence peddlers and business people, and therefore they give certain politicians who are otherwise thieves a veneer of spiritual legality.
How can we stop that? Should we stop that?
We should. But it is not going to be easy, because when people invoke the name of God, the congregation is frozen, and many people do not have the ability to interrogate this kind of situation. And you know, I love the Bible because the Bible also speaks about such individuals. If you look at the book of the Acts of the Apostle, Paul says that in his days they were the church people of a place called Berea, and the difference between the people of Berea and Thessalonica is that every evening when Paul had spoken to them, they would go and interrogate the Bible to determine whether Paul was speaking the truth. If the Christians were able to do that, they would be able to discover that some of these individuals are essentially cultic leaders who want to use their tithes for personal benefit.
The 10%
the 10% of the money that they pay. The tithing, they are the ones who use the money. That is why they can
use the tithe.
And we now have a new phenomenon.
Do you pay your tithe?
I do pay my tithe,
every month?
My church is an organized church, so that the money does not go to the bishop. The money goes into an institutionalized process, and the bishop or the pastors have a salary. But these husband and wife formations, where the husband is a pastor and the wife is a pastor and the son is the secretary and the daughter is the treasurer. These are essentially pyramid schemes which have been put together by individuals who have capitalized on what I call the Jesus industry. And this Jesus industry is being abused by the invocation of the name of Christ in a manner that is improper and to the detriment of the people of God and to the detriment of their countries. They deserve condemnation. And they are peddling lies and selling miracles. And during the election time, they threaten people. They use the word of God to threaten people for their temporal joy and glory. They are the latter-day Pharisees, if you ask me.
You have them in Kenya as well?
Oh, there is no shortage of them. They are popping out from every corner of the streets with all manner of names: achievers, determiners. They have no shortage of names. Helicopter, there is no shortage of them. They are popping up everywhere with mega churches, complete with jets and other things. They are rock stars.
Should television stations like us stop giving them opportunity?
Of course, in the name of freedom of information, you assume that your audience is capable of discerning who are lying and who is not lying, and therefore you bombard them with the information and they make a determination as to whether they want to elect. But the tragedy is that in matters of God, anybody who invokes the name of God is given the benefit of doubt. And see, this self-anointing bishop sits out in his house and he calls himself a bishop. The next time he calls himself an apostle. We ought now also to have a disclaimer, even when you give them the airtime, that you are not responsible for what they say. Perhaps that is the best you can do.
Yeah,
he put a disclaimer.
A disclaimer there.
Yeah.
Maybe they will not pay our bills anymore. Let me take you back to colonialism.
Yes.
And we're looking at the African corruption challenge and the African leadership challenge. And most of the African countries, the major ones colonized by Britain, similar style, some of it direct, some of it indirect, Nigeria and other places. Eventually structures were set up, basically the civil service. And then there were structures that set up for the evacuation of natural resources to Europe for the purpose of processing and selling it to the rest of the world and selling some of it back to Africa. So this was the circumstances of Africa in the 1960s, which was a watershed year for the decolonization of Africa. Before Nkrumah talked about neocolonialism. Do you think that there were elements in that arrangement that perhaps facilitated the new corruption that occurred in Africa in the early 60s? Without doubt. Remember that the colonization project in many African countries, what came was Imperial British East African Company. And this was a company that was formed for purposes of exploitation of African resources. So the political colonial infrastructure came to support the economic infrastructure. And when they were leaving, they created an environment that was designed to ensure that their interests in Africa was not interfered with. It is in that context that you can see the land laws, the inviolability of the title deeds that had been issued. It is in that context that you see in the banking industry, whether you are talking about Barclays Bank of Kenya, Standard Chartered, all these things were designed in that manner. And many European countries for a long time, whenever they were dealing with Africans post-independence, actually factored corruption as a business expense. They assumed that when you deal with African leaders, you've got to corrupt them. Pay them. Pay them. And we have evidence across the world. If you look at the history of people like Mobutu Sese Seko, the money would be tucked away in Paris or tucked away in Was that on the Cold War? Was that on the Cold
War
factor?
Even immediately after, in 1960s, when he took over from Joseph Kasavubu and Patrice Emery Lumumba, it all started. And you can look at all the countries. The colonial structure was informed by the fact that you had to recruit these individuals into the post-colonial arena. And look at any one of these leaders, most of them. If you go to the former French colonies and you speak about leaders like Félix Houphouët-Boigny, even our own, even Leopold Sédar Senghor, apart from in the French colonies, the only persons who stood out and extricated themselves from that snare were Modibo Keita of Mali and Ahmed Sékou Touré of Guinea. In the former British colonies, the only people who stood out very early on were Kwame Nkrumah and Kenneth David Kaunda and Julius Kambarage Nyerere. The others like Jomo Kenyatta, Kamuzu Banda were very quickly recruited into this particular structure. So it is right to say that colonialism was responsible for sowing the seeds of corruption as a business expense of recruiting African leaders as, in the words of somebody, as their agent for purposes of perpetuating the new child that was going to be nurtured to ensure that the colonial project succeeded, the neo-colonial project.
That said, and so 1960s gone, 70s gone, military rule took over, people were worried about corruption and abuse of power, so the era of the generals occurred in Africa from the late 60s throughout the 70s and some extent the 80s. And then eventually the Berlin Wall collapsed and the whole world reorganized itself and reshaped itself into a new dimension. And then came the exploitation of democracy, which we still have, by the way. Now, would you say that the exploitation of democracy post-Cold War also had intentions of the colonial structures of 1960?
I can't agree with you. Remember that although, of course, you can't have neat lines, but the collapse of the Berlin Wall demonstrated one thing, that you no longer had a bipolar world. The collapse of the Soviet Union and therefore the loss of luster of the communist socialist model as an alternative political system was a triumph of Washington, London, Paris, Brussels, Madrid axis of Western democracy, multi-party democracy as constituting democracy. So what happened is that we have what I call franchise democracies, a la McDonald's, a la Kentucky Fried Chicken. So you are told that these are the fundamentals, so that if you look at the constitutions made in Africa post-Berlin Wall, 90% they are the same. You have the typical separation of powers, you've got to have plural politics, you've got to have the human rights and all these things, and essentially therefore what you have is that we are creating designer democracies. Unfortunately, in many African countries, these particular structures are bastardized in the sense that periodic ritualistic elections are then seen as the touchstone of democracy. We say we are democratic because we hold elections, but that is just an aspect of what democracy should be. But the truth is that democracy is a lot more. Democracy, I think, must also have been formed by the culture and realities of a particular country. And if you give me a little latitude, if you look at your typical European nation, they are nation states. The Danes are just the Danes. The Swedes are just the Swedes with the little Samis. The Norwegians are just the Norwegians. The Germans are just the Germans. And where they have multi-ethnic communities in Europe, they have a problem. Look at Spain. Look at the former Eastern Europe. Africa is unique because African countries, having been arbitrarily parceled out, we are states of many nations. And therefore how we deal even with the political party is very different. Look at the Democratic Republic of Congo with 230 plus ethnic groups. Look at Kenya with 42 plus ethnic groups, Uganda with 31, and I believe Ghana has
in the 30s as well.
In the 30s. So you are dealing with people who are put together, have to live together. You find some ethnic groups in Togo, some in Burkina Faso.
Same ethnic groups.
And same ethnic
in
groups.
Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana.
And Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana.
Speaking the same language.
The same language. So you have nations which are divided, and somehow, and Nkrumah and Nyerere were the architects of this in 1964 in Cairo, when some argue, let us redraw the boundaries. But Nkrumah and Nyerere said, we've got to adopt the doctrine of the inviolability of the inherited boundaries, because if we start to undo the boundaries, we will be in conflict until the second coming of the Christ. And there is a sense, therefore, in which we can make something out of our countries. But the question that we must ask, this democracy that was tailor-made for us in Washington and given to us, complete with donor money to help us educate our people, complete with donor money to help us make the Constitution, is it working? Is it achieving what we desire? And what do we desire? These are the foundational questions that I think we must pose and answer going forward. because many countries are now beginning to question whether this process can work. The question of the term limits, for example, was an aspect of this post-Berlin constitution. And we have seen what I call the making and unmaking of African constitution. In Uganda, they have amended the constitution. In Rwanda, they're about to do it.
On time limits.
On time limits. They are saying, no, Africa is unique. Africa is unique and our countries are unique. And because we are unique...
That's a problem. My question to you really, I'll come back to Uganda and Paul Kagame, but my question to you really is, this democracy that was passed to us, do you find the intentions in there, as it was in 1960, those intentions that you described to sustain the natural resource-rich country, to be able to raise resources for the West, not really about giving them freedom, not really about giving them democracy, but to create a state of affairs that maintains the status quo of 1960. They are resource rich, they'll give us resources, we use the resources, develop it and sell it back to them. How they develop really is not our priority. Was that intention, can we glean that intention in this democracy that was passed?
In fact, they are very blatant. Ronald Reagan said, America does what is in America's best interest. And whatever you see that is being done in terms of telling us to do certain things, the fundamental agenda, the unspoken agenda, is that these are countries that we want to retain for purposes of having resources taken away. That is the agenda. The European agenda, the colonialist agenda has never changed, and it will never change.
Should we then be looking at changing fundamentally the construction of the democracy that we have, to think through a new system of government that will first give us and offer us the best brains and the best minds putting their foot forward, as the Americans do, as the British do, that will possibly eliminate corruption to the barest minimum, that will also guarantee that their public service actors are experts who know what they're about and they're also well remunerated, and that the sizes are cut down. That will guarantee that our markets are working. That will guarantee food security. That will guarantee that we are in control of our own resources. Should Africa start thinking about a system of government that will produce this, not the democracy that we have, another system of government?
You know, perhaps let us understand what democracy is because I think there is a sense in which we assume that democracy is as defined for us. What I'm talking about, without labeling it a democracy or anything, is that we need systems of government that are able to respond to our needs. And I've said at a different forum that if under the aegis of the African Union, Africa can meet and have single agenda meetings, what is the African problem? So that we determine what the African
They never
problem.
have single agenda meetings?
Single agenda
They never have that?
No, they have multiple agenda meetings on things that are really secondary to the African interest. Have a single agenda meeting which says, what do we want? And after that, what do we do? And how do we do it? So 3 meetings at which experts are given the opportunity to drive the agenda. The assumption and the tragedy in Africa is the assumption by anybody who is elected in office that by dint of election they now have monopoly of knowledge. Even the village fool, upon being elected as a representative of the people, is now assumed suddenly to have become all wise. And that is tragic. You find politicians, somebody who is a certified illiterate, going out there and telling us what the curriculum should be. And the professors who are trained in curriculum have no role in that agenda. I can't agree with you, therefore, that Africa ought to engage in a debate as to what system of government will deliver the African promise.
That's interesting. And if you're just joining us, this is P.L.O Lumumba, and you're seeing him here on Good Evening Ghana. I'm sure you Googled him and saw him, and you've seen most of his oratory presentations and convincing a lot of people about how Africa can move forward. You talked about, and this is the last question on democracy, because you seem to have echoed the ideas of Paul Collier, who you may have read in The Bottom Billion.
Yes.
And Mr. Collier was talking about, and he used Botswana as a situation, and he is expressing the view that checks and balances, in terms of separation of powers and checks and balances, is more important than term elections. And he talks about Botswana in that regard. So we say that 1 4-year term, a maximum 2 terms of that may be insufficient for a government to do what it wants to do. And so some say 5-year term. Liberia have an interesting situation where the first term is 6 years and the second term is 4 years. So when your term expires in Liberia, if you have been successful over 2 terms, you would have done a 10-year term, which appears sufficient. But the narrative is the key, and who is putting out that narrative? Should it be Paul Kagame putting out that narrative after he's been in office for that long already? Should it be the Ugandan leader Yoweri Museveni putting out that narrative after he's been in office for that long, seeking to extend their own term? That creates conflict. Is that what you are supporting?
I don't support that. I hold the view. And if you read Yoweri Museveni in his earlier days in 1986, he took the view that part of the African problem are leaders who suffer from what I have called the prima donna syndrome, the refusal to leave the stage at the appropriate time. And Museveni himself was very critical of such leaders. Paul Kagame himself was critical of President Museveni's longevity in power. I hold the view that no matter how good you are, in order to allow a country to grow and in order to allow institutions to thrive, it is now demonstrated that most leaders perform best during the first 5 in their 10 years. And after that, no matter how good your ideas are, because you are a member of an institution, you leave the stage and you become part of an advisory team. So I'm a supporter of term limits. But what I'm saying is that in order to ensure that this particular system works, we ought to ensure that we have institutions, because ultimately, and you've seen it in Europe, countries such as Italy, which has had more than 50 governments since the World War, the reason why those countries actually succeed is because the individual holders of the office are merely cogs in the wheel. In Africa, the reverse is the case, because individuals who are in office, particularly the guerrilla leaders who came in the 1980s, they have personal armies. The armies are actually personal properties. If you go to the Ugandan army, it is a Museveni army, the Kagame army in Rwanda, the Meles Zenawi before he died army in Ethiopia. And therefore, essentially, we may have what we call elections, but they are not elections. People vote out of fear because they are told, if you remove me, we'll go back where we came from. So it is threats that make them vote for these individuals. Yet these individuals have a unique opportunity to demonstrate that I have run my leg and I'm now giving my successor, and I will be available to him or to her for purposes of guidance.
So term limits is agreed by Professor Lumumba.
Yes.
Let's talk about a very vexed issue, controversial one that development economics have found out. And it is you draw a line of 2 columns and you have development in one column and you have human rights in another. And the suspicion is that as far as third world is concerned, you always have a conflict between development and human rights. That where you have human rights, you may not have development. Where you have development, you may not have human rights. So the greatest development stories of Singapore will come with the very bitter story of anti-human rights. The finest development stories in Ghana in the Nkrumah years will also show a certain Preventive Detention Act law that imprisoned people arbitrarily on the whims of the president, which eventually occasioned the coup against him. You will look in modern days of Paul Kagame, a beautiful development story in Rwanda, but you will find that the human rights have been severely abused. Even if you look at the history of some of the most developed countries, you look at Britain, for instance, there was a time when people were put to work and to build the infrastructure and they were not paid the regular salaries. We've just seen the movie 10 Years a Slave, which depicts what happened in America in the days of the slave trade, the days of the cornfields and developing America's agriculture. So how do you see that vexed question? You know, should we celebrate Paul Kagame or should we hang him for human rights abuse? Should we celebrate the Singaporean leader Lee Kuan Yew, or should we hang him for human rights abuse? Should we celebrate Dr. Nkrumah, or shall we hang him for human rights abuse? What's your answer to that?
My own view that is a question that, as you rightly said, is a vexed question. And there are those civil libertarians who say we have human rights, they are indivisible, they are inviolable, they are universal, and they must never be abused. I believe that there are certain core human rights which must never be derogated from. For example, freedom of conscience. That is one that you cannot derogate from. The right to life is one that you cannot derogate from. The question of freedom of association is one that I think sometimes ought to be limited. I hold
That's
that view.
interesting. Freedom of association.
Freedom of association.
So one-party states should be allowed
I believe
sometimes.
that sometimes in the history of nations, it may become necessary to limit freedom of association to ensure that people move in some direction.
And I qualify it to mean freedom of political association.
Freedom
Does
of
it include political association?
it means freedom of political association.
That's interesting, Professor
but
Lumumba.
look at
you're
it.
You're going to be hit hard for this.
I know.
If I put this on the web.
Yeah, you put it on the web.
Yeah, they're going to say that here goes Lumumba.
Yes.
A dictatorialist.
Yes.
Supremacist.
And I'm prepared to receive all the
Under
verbs.
what conditions should we limit political association?
Look at countries which are multi-ethnic. If people organize political parties around ethnicity, I think that should be stopped. I believe that we ought to recognize that in order to ensure that the political parties we form have a national character, we should not have political parties which will address narrow ethnic interests. So that if you want to register a political party in a multi-ethnic environment, you must have membership across the board as a condition precedent to its being registered. That, I think, is a limitation that is necessary. Freedom...
No, I'm talking about where we think only one political party must exist.
No, one political party. No, not one political party.
Because Kwame Nkrumah passed the law in Ghana, which you may not be aware of. He entitled it the Avoidance of Discrimination Act.
Yes.
And the Avoidance of Discrimination Act was passed because there were parties that were formed along ethnic lines.
Yes.
Incidentally, when he had passed that Avoidance of Discrimination Act, all of those little parties formed what you call the United Party.
Yes.
And so they formed the United Party, which became the big opposition.
Yes.
Its antecedent is the opposition party in Ghana today, the MPP.
Yes.
So that's an interesting history about that. But Nkrumah titled it the Avoidance of Discrimination Act.
Yes.
Is that the kind of view that you're expressing?
No, let me be understood very clear. I don't support one-party state.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that you allow plurality of views through institutions that do not represent narrow interests. So allow the political parties, but ensure that if a party is going to be registered, it must on the face of it represent the national face, because it is only then that is capable of articulating a national agenda. So that what one must do is to ensure that individuals who are going to run with their ethnic groups are not allowed to do so. But you remember this, the problem in Africa, because parties are not ideologically based, and Chinua Achebe talks about this when he talks about Obafemi Awolowo in the 1960s, that while Obafemi thought that he was speaking for Nigerians, when he looked behind, he saw that it is not the singer, is not the song that the people were responding to, but the singer. So most of his people who followed him were his own Yoruba, and so too with Nnamdi Azikiwe. So the African populace, the African illiterate, the default position is that they revert to their default instincts of ethnic association. So that is the next battle. The next battle is to ensure that we tell Africans that political parties are merely vehicles for articulating your interest in agriculture, in education, in health, in infrastructure, and that then becomes the platform of determining whether a political party ought to be elected into office. That is easier said than done. Easier said than done, because the bankrupt politician will always go back and invoke the ethnic card and say, it is our turn to eat, if you may, and that if I'm the president, we will be in a good position. And people vote for what I call feel-good effect, so that if one is from one tribe, you say, my president is from the president is from my tribe, and people feel good. Africans should liberate themselves from those primitive thoughts, and to realize that in the 21st century what we need are men and women who can deliver regardless of their ethnic extraction.
So we've talked about Nigeria. We'll talk about South Africa as well, because that's also one of the big African pillars. But this interview cannot be concluded without talking about your own Kenya. Recent incidents in Kenya, some good, some bad. The election of Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto as president, two young men, one son of the great leader. How is that shaping out in Kenya after what was an ill-fated election, a massive sort of civil war in which our President Kufuor, took charge of the reconciliation effort with Ambassador Kofi Annan and co. After that, Uhuru Kenyatta is elected as president. Then there's Al-Shabaab threat that affects Kenya. And recently, the historic visit of one of your own, Barack Obama, to Kenya. We'll talk about these matters after the break. So we'll do Kenya, we'll do South Africa, and then we'll ask Professor Lumumba, so what's the way forward? How does he see Africa in the next 10 years? That will be the final part of the interview. After the break, we'll continue. Welcome back. Thank you very much. I'm sure that you're enjoying this interview tremendously, and we're happy that Prof is still here with us. We have another 10 minutes before we wrap up, but we'll squeeze as much in that 10 minutes as we can. So let's talk about Kenya, and let me talk about the two leaders, Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto. Are they the best for Kenya at this time? They are young. They seem to have money, so the temptation for corruption may not be available as it is. Uhuru seems to have a family tradition, heritage that he wants to protect. His father's name, the name of Jomo in the family. Is it working in Kenya?
I believe that many Kenyans will have different views as to whether this is the best team that they elected. But they are in office. I don't believe that they are immune from corruption. In fact, it is true now that corruption is alive and well. I personally have raised the question that corruption ought to be declared a national disaster. The president in the month of March issued Executive Order number 6, in which he identifies corruption as a major issue. So corruption is alive and well. Kenya is one of the most corrupt nations on earth. But the beauty of the situation now is that the political leadership has realized that this is a problem. But corruption will only be fought if leadership is committed in a visible manner, and if the population is also committed in a visible manner. The problem in Kenya, like most African countries, is impunity. Individuals who we know are corrupt are in public office. Individuals who have engaged in corruption are taken through the criminal justice system, then they are acquitted and they are elected into public office. Corruption, there are two problems that threaten the Kenyan nation today: negative ethnicity and corruption. If we don't address those two
Why do you
issues,
have negative ethnicity? Don't you have your president and your vice from different tribes?
That is the tragedy of it, because as I've said at a different forum, in Kenyan politics, we have political parties which are essentially not political parties in the classical sense. What we have are ethnic alliances of one kind or the other. So in the position, you have one ethnic alliance. In government, we have one ethnic alliance. And this, in my view, is the dangerous thing. So that I've said, and I repeat it here, that in Kenya, like most African countries, what we call elections are actually ethnic censors to determine which combination of ethnic groups is larger than the other. Then they serve in office. We must liberate ourselves from that. Going forward, it is not going to be easy.
It's cultural.
It is cultural, and it is dangerous.
In our DNA.
It is, that is the tragedy. It appears to be in our behavioral DNA, but in our neighborhood in Tanzania,
education change that?
Education, if it is directed in a positive way, has it been done? It has been done. In the neighborhood in Tanzania, with many more ethnic groups, through the effort of the Nyerere regime, men and women are elected into office on the basis of their ability, because the parties are not anchored in ethnicity. So it can be done. That is why I don't believe that is embedded in our DNA. It is the bankrupt politician whose interest is short-term agenda who allows ethnicity to be the only way of political mobilization. And that, I think, is dangerous to a young country such as ours.
I see. That's quite worrying coming from you. Why did you contest for parliament, Professor Lumumba?
You know, in the year 2007, I said, because many people who had listened to me said, but you say these things, go and offer yourself, and you have the opportunity to serve. I decided to form my own political party. And
why didn't you join any of the political parties? I didn't
join any of the political parties because I didn't think that they represented what I wanted. One of them, who is dominated by an individual from my political party, must have required that I pay homage to individuals rather than to ideology. The others, of course, were also inclined in a direction that I didn't think that was new. And there was a new thinking. There was new thinking that you needed fresh blood. And I therefore went out in an urban constituency where I grew up as a young man, and I said, I'm forming a party of patriots. I had a campaign agenda, attended 200 town hall meetings, bribed nobody. And then
you didn't spend money on your campaign?
Not at all. My friends gave me Kenya shillings 3 million. I spent only 1 million in the
How much is Kenya shillings, $3 million?
$3 million at that time could have been not more than slightly less than $20,000 at that time.
Oh, I see. Was that sufficient for campaign?
It was sufficient in my view.
Wow.
I spent only 1 million, and the rest 2 million, which I didn't utilize.
So you probably spent $7,000?
Yes, and I distributed to charity after the election. I've then written a book after that, my experience, called a call for hygiene in Kenyan politics. Because
people were attending your town hall
people
rallies.
were attending my town
You
hall
didn't give them
rallies.
transportation
I didn't
back home.
give them transport.
You didn't give them water to drink.
I didn't give them water to drink.
That's not fair, Professor Lumumba.
Because they came for meetings that were no more than 1 hour. And
yeah, but you needed to give them water to drink.
No, they don't need water to drink.
I think they did.
You
wanted them to buy their own water?
They don't need water. If you have a commitment and you want a leader who is going to represent you.
But even Jesus Christ fed the 5,000 after
Jesus
they had
Christ,
listened to
the
him.
Son of God.
Yes, but he felt the need that these people have come to listen to him, that he needed to do something. So he tapped into his miraculous powers,
yes.
which you and I may not possess.
No, I
hold. What you possess is the money.
I hold the view that you don't. If you call people for a meeting at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and they are with you for 1 hour, you don't have to bribe them. Because
giving them water is not bribery, Professor.
My own view is that people must be committed to a cause.
Yes, you don't give them money, but you give them water.
No, I did not.
Or Coca-Cola.
If that was a mistake, I did not. I hold the view, and I'm protected by this in Tanzania. The Tanzanian court has said that if you invite people to a rally and give them food, that is bribery, and I hold that view. When we invite them to
it's going to be a very difficult view to push across.
I know, but if you invite people to political rallies in the stadium, do you give them water?
Yes, we give them water. We give them Coca-Cola. We give them Fanta. We give them food.
That is a tragedy.
Meat pie.
That is a tragedy.
But they have to eat.
They've go and eat in their houses.
They can't afford it.
They should afford it.
The economy doesn't help them to afford it.
The economy, that is the economy that we want to create. Because
yeah, but when we create it, then we can do
no,
that.
if you feed them for 1 hour.
But in America, they do. If Barack Obama calls a rally, they give them food.
That is the tragedy of comparing ourselves with the United States of America. I've always held the view that is a demonstration and a mark of inferiority complex. The assumption that what America does is the be-all, end-all is wrong. My own view is that we must do things. I attend many meetings. I go to many places and I don't take allowances. 1 hour sufficiently. If you can't sacrifice for 1 hour that you've got to be fed, then what is the sacrifice that you are making?
Should be fine.
No.
Okay, so you didn't win or you won?
I didn't win.
You came second?
I didn't. In fact, what happened in that particular constituency is that the elections were disrupted 8 months down the line. The court declared one of the candidates as having won.
If it was fair, are you confident you would have won?
I don't think I would have won because the votes were on the basis of ethnicity. Voters were imported. I am quite certain that if the votes had been counted properly, I would still have been one of the losing candidates. It's a clear demonstration.
Also, you didn't give water, so you were not very popular.
Perhaps. But everybody during the process said, these are the ideas that we need. And I'm not just
They agreed with your ideas?
Oh, yeah, with the ideas. Yeah.
Okay. And they will impose them on the candidates who won.
They can't impose them because once the individual is elected, he acquires.
We're running out of time. I want to ask you about Africa's single currency because economies are falling apart. But South Africa on the downward spiral, maybe 40 seconds, you can say that Mandela, then they came to Thabo Mbeki, and now Jacob Zuma. Is South Africa on a downward spiral?
South Africa is an interesting economy. You must be remembered the South African economy is still 80% white. And for that reason, there is a sense in which South Africa, going forward and holding all factors constant, South Africa will go down. Number one, because the blacks are impatient. They thought that with the departure of apartheid, there would be instant coffee solution. And that is why you see South African politicians such as Julius Malema are beginning to appeal to the masses of the people because they are promising jobs and promising instant coffee solution to problems. And my own view, therefore, is that South Africa must sit back and re-examine. I do hope that when Cyril Ramaphosa becomes the president post-Zuma, having had experience.
Will he become?
I think he will be.
But they say he's corrupt.
Even if
one of the attacks against Cyril is corruption.
That,
so you shouldn't be supporting Cyril.
No, I don't support him. I'm not South African, but I hope that if he comes in, having had been a beneficiary of the black empowerment, having been in the labor movement before he joined, that he will have the sense. He remember that he went into business under the black empowerment before he came into politics. Big time. He's one of the billionaires in South Africa.
They say he's corrupt.
Yes, they do say he's corrupt. I do not know whether he's corrupt, but the fact is that he's a player in South African politics. He's now the deputy president. He will be the one that ANC will elect. And if you are in ANC for the next 15 years in South Africa, you are going to be the president of South Africa. Fact.
What should we do in the next 5 years? How do you see Africa in the next 5 years? That's a very last question.
In the next 5 years, I see, holding all factors constant, a few African countries will begin to realize their potential. And I can identify these countries as emerging countries which may begin to move in the right direction. I think that Ethiopia is a country that will move in the right direction. I think Mozambique will move in the right direction. I think Botswana will move in the right direction. I see signs of right direction of movement in Malawi. I see that in Zambia. Ghana still worries me. There are certain fundamentals in Ghana, and I'll only speak confidently about Ghana after the election that are due, I think, next year.
Yeah, next year.
Nigeria also may move in the right direction if they deal with the problem of Boko Haram. So holding all factors constant, there are a number of African countries which will emerge and begin to move in the right direction.
Over the next 5 to 10 years.
Over the next 10 years. 5 years is too short. But there are certain African countries which must know fundamental change. I believe the Democratic Republic of Congo must know fundamental change. Most French-speaking countries must decolonize their minds, because French-speaking countries, whether you are speaking Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, Gabon, Togo, and all these countries, they are gravitating towards France, and they are behaving as if they are being recolonized. There must be a fundamental change in their minds.
Is Libya gone forever?
Libya will take no less than 20 years to stabilize.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
I'll come to Kenya and look for you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
God bless
That
you.
was P.L.O Lumumba. Thanks for watching. Good night.